Welcome, and thank you for joining us. So this session is on 25700 Modern Slavery. My name is David Adamson, and I work for the British Standards Institution. So what I do at British Standards Institution is I work with committee members such as Dr. Trottrams and Dr. Jardine, and we put together these standards. So today we have 45 minutes, and I'm going to speak just for 5 minutes or so to maybe introduce the subject in BSI before handing over to my two colleagues. I would mention that, as normal, if they want to put in any kind of comment or question, feel free please to use the chat function. And then towards the end of the session, we'll allow time to answer any questions. About BSI, I always like to show this picture. It shows the founders of the BSI group, which was the Engineering Standards Committee in 1901, founded by Sir John Wolfe-Barry. He's the same man who designed London's Tower Bridge. Now they were focusing on tram lines, the thickness of the gauge of the tram line, and they were able to reduce it by getting together and working for consensus from 100 to 10 different sizes, which helps enormously. And so that's what we do in standards. In 1918, BSI extended its standardization work and became British Engineering Standards Association. And from there, it received a royal charter. And from there, it became the BSI group, so that it was able to diversify its business activities and trading activities. The kite mark, I think you can see it at the bottom right here. Just move my little screen out of the way. That kite mark was first registered in 1903, and it's recognized by 82% of the UK adult population. BSI is the UK's national standards body. Every country has one national standards body, and so it is BSI. It's not part of the government, often asked, but it does work closely with government departments to further the public interest, especially BAYS. So with that, I shall turn away from BSI and look at the standard and a little bit about standardization. So 25700 is a name, the number of the standard that we're working on. A standard simply is an agreed, repeatable way of doing things. So Alex and Akila, their job is to bring the stakeholders together, interested parties, and to achieve consensus for this agreed, repeatable way of doing things. In this case, it's a guidance document. It's a new document, by the way, which makes it even more difficult. I appreciate with this standards conference and awards, many of the people listening will be well-versed in standards. So not to teach anyone to suck eggs here, but when you're dealing with a new subject and can be a sensitive subject, it can be very, very difficult to achieve consensus. So my hat's off to both Akila and Alex so far, but they have some way to go yet toward publication. The publication, as you see, we're hoping to get it finished by May 2022, but the draft for public consultation, this is where the public can have a look at that, and we very much appreciate comments because it helps to improve the document. That will be no later than January. It could come a bit sooner, but I would encourage you to have a look at the newsletters that you receive or any kind of announcements we're saying that this is available for DPC. And as well as that, just an appeal that standards making is voluntary. But frankly, we're very lucky in the UK, the model that the UK has, that it's free to participate. And even fair enough, you don't get anything in money in return, but many countries actually charge to participate, but they have different models. So in the UK, it's a good model and it's been very successful, as evidenced by the number of fantastic standards that have been produced by BSI, generated by BSI, 9,000 to 14,000, so quality, the environment, etc. If you would like to check into that, just Google the Becoming the Standards Maker at BSI, and there's plenty of information on the role and responsibility. So I'd like to introduce Akila. So Akila, that's your cue to I'm going to actually stop sharing screen now so that you can share, and I'm going to introduce you now so you can get your slide up. Oh, sorry, I'm doing that for you, aren't I? Beg your pardon.
That's correct.
Okay, so Akila, Dr. Akila Jardine, she's the co-chair of the BSI Technical Committee working on 25700. She's a senior policy lead on modern slavery at Orbis Procurement. Orbis Procurement is a shared services partnership between Brighton and Hove City Council, East Sussex County Council, and Surrey County Council. Her role involves overseeing the design and delivery of anti-slavery approaches within the authority's supply chains. Before joining Orbis Procurement, she was a research fellow focusing on modern slavery, labor exploitation, and business response with the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Okay, so I am going to have to do a rather sloppy, I'm afraid, change over here because, but fortunately we have it. Get this slide up for Akila. We'll put this on presentation mode. Just Akila, can I just check? Sorry, is it just that one slide there?
It's just a holding slide.
Okay.
Thanks for the introduction, Dave. And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to take part in this breakout session. Before my colleague Alex talks more specifically about the BSI standard that we're developing, I'd like to spend about 10 minutes or so just talking about the problem of modern slavery, including the legislative landscape in the UK, which aims to ensure organizational response to tackling modern slavery within supply chains. So the best place to probably start is, what exactly is modern slavery? Modern slavery, it's a very contested term, which lacks a universally agreed definition, but it's come to be understood as an umbrella term, so encompassing a range of exploitative practices and other legal concepts such as slavery, servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, for instance. And so we have to be really clear about how we use the term modern slavery. When we refer to modern slavery, we don't mean sweatshop labor or all instances of poor working conditions. Essentially, what modern slavery is that it refers to situations of exploitation that people are unable to escape because of threats, violence, coercion, deception, abuse of power, or even vulnerability. And so the practice of modern slavery sits at the extreme end of a continuum of exploitation. So if you think about it, ranging from decent working practices to more severe extreme forms of exploitation amounting to modern slavery. And so modern slavery, it's a problem that's impacting millions of men, women, and children worldwide. And so globally, it's difficult to quantify, but globally it's estimated that there's over 40 million people enslaved. And of these, it's said that 24.9 million are actually exploited for forced labor. Now, within the UK, it's estimated that there are over 100,000 victims. And so we have several factors. No industry or country is immune to modern slavery, but there are several factors that can increase its occurrence. So, for instance, discrimination against certain groups of workers, limited opportunities for employment, poverty, inadequate regulation of labor rights and employment rights. So no country or industry or organization really is entirely immune to these practices because people can be trafficked across borders, be exploited, while you have goods and services, tainted with exploitative labor. They can end up in global supply chains. And so modern slavery really, it's this complex problem. It is a criminal justice issue. But it also represents a grave violation of people's fundamental human rights and also labor rights. You'll find that the right to not to be held in slavery and forced labor is echoed in core international human rights as well as labor rights conventions. But then also modern slavery, it's a significant threat to the state's sustainable development agenda. So many of you are aware that in 2015, the United Nations included the eradication of modern slavery as part of its 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So this sits on the goal 8, which focuses on sustained, I think, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, and so really around decent work. But then modern slavery is also connected. It's not an isolated issue, but it's also connected to other sustainable development goals, such as those focusing on like poverty, inequality, responsible consumption, for instance. And so what we found is that the UN SDGs, really put modern slavery firmly on the political agenda for many governments and actors in the international community. And in the last decade, there has been an increase in policies and regulations and legislations on modern slavery, and more so on the role of businesses in this anti-slavery agenda as part of the larger or broader business and human rights agenda. So organizations are now under increasing pressure to ensure that their organizations, the operations and their supply chains are not tainted with slave labor. And we find that there's numerous pressure or factors driving corporate action. So you have pressure from NGOs, reputational and financial risks, for instance, pressure from industry peers, but also government regulation. And within the UK, presently, a key driver of organizational response to modern slavery is the UK's Modern Slavery Act, which was introduced in 2015. So this was the first legislation of its kind to specifically address the problem of modern slavery. And a key provision in legislation is Section 54 of, which focuses on transparency in supply chains. And what this clause requires is that organizations with a certain turnover must now publish annually a modern slavery statement outlining the steps that they've taken or have not taken to address modern slavery in the supply chains. The Act doesn't specify what should be included in this statement, but so it's up to businesses to determine, what sort of areas they want to cover, but it does suggest some areas that businesses might want to consider when drafting their modern slavery statement. And so that leads to numerous criticisms and shortcomings of the legislation, all of which I wouldn't get into today, but I'm more than happy to discuss in the Q&As. But generally, the criticisms include the inconsistency between the quality of the statement, so which prevents like a level playing fields in business conduct, but also the legislation's lack of teeth and enforcement. It's focusing a lot on transparency and reporting, rather than the actual steps taken by organizations to tackle modern slavery. So really the focus has been on what businesses are saying rather than what they're actually doing to tackle this issue. And, certainly, we do have to acknowledge that more businesses are paying attention to the problem of modern slavery. But again, a lot of them are treating it as a purely compliance issue and, doing the bare minimum to comply with legislation. And again, also one of the issues is that in terms of corporate response to modern slavery, it's purely viewed as a risk to an organization rather than a risk to people. And so a lot of businesses may be concerning themselves, like, for instance, protecting their reputation rather than the victims and vulnerable people that are operating in their operations and their supply chains. So I'm going to pause there, but now that I've given an overview of modern slavery and an insight into modern slavery policy in the UK, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Alex.
Before you do,
standard.
Akila, before you do, there's a couple questions there. Just and I know Alex is going to talk about the implementation, but you mentioned just a couple of things here, and I think we should get you while your voice is still with us, because I know you've got a cold, and I hope you can still articulate it. You said it lacks teeth. The legislation often lacks teeth and in enforcement, and what they're focusing on and what they're reporting rather than what they're actually doing. So that being the case, with the standard that's being developed, 25700, do you see that is an opportunity to change things? And if so, how?
Sorry, Dave, continue.
And if you do, how might, what might?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alex, I think, will be covering more of this in his talk, but essentially what the standards are hoping to do is to allow businesses or support businesses in going above and beyond compliance as well. As I mentioned, to comply with the legislation, it's simply a case of, drafting a modern slavery statement and having it signed and approved by the most senior member of the organization and publishing it on the website. And that isn't really, and while there are existing guidance out there, I think this standard aims to help and support businesses in going above and beyond that compliance piece, but also educating businesses and not think of modern slavery as a risk to their operations, but also a risk to people and victims within their supply chains and operations.
Okay, thanks. Do you mind if I just continue to pick on you? Because the questions I think are to you, while it's still fresh in our minds, will there still be a turnover threshold in the new legislation? I'm concerned about the lower turnover companies, which are more likely to be hiring unethically. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. So I'm not aware of whether there's going to be a new threshold. The government did publish a response to an independent review and public consultation on the legislation. And I can't remember there being a reference to a change in turnover. So for those who don't know, the turnover is currently set at 36 million. However, what the government is proposing to do is to extend the legislation, Section 54, to cover not just commercial organizations, but also public sector bodies, such as local authorities and councils that have a budget of 36 million or more. So right now, that's definitely going to cover a lot more organizations. I think it's estimated that the legislation covers about 18,000 businesses. And regarding the second point of that question, I completely agree with you. I think, a lot of, as in my previous role as well, my research is quite focused a lot on the role of small businesses, particularly SMEs in anti-slavery agenda. The legislation only captures, a small amount of businesses. As I mentioned, there's 18,000 businesses that are captured by legislation, and we have potentially 6 million businesses that don't meet that threshold, but where modern slavery risks can be the highest, particularly in sectors such as construction or agriculture, for instance, that rely more on or have more smaller businesses. But I think with large organizations, they're the ones that, have the opportunity or capacity to influence and exert pressure as well. But what we're finding is that that responsibility to tackle modern slavery is being cascaded down to small organizations as part of large enterprises due diligence measures as well. And so even though those companies that may have a lower turnover might not necessarily meet the threshold of the legislation, therefore don't legally have to produce a modern slavery statement, they're finding that responsibility is actually hitting them as part of their contractual relationships with larger entities.
Okay, at the risk of, I think the timing will be that we won't do a communal Q&A. Why don't we just finish up with a couple questions? Did you see Anita's question, Anita? I think this is probably Anita Punwani, if I'm correct. But forgive me if I'm wrong on that. She says, excellent presentation, thank you. Some people will not be aware that slavery is still an issue, never mind a human rights issue. In the process of your stakeholder engagement, what has been the most effective way of raising business awareness of their responsibility of this global issue?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And I completely agree with Anita. I think a lot of people think that we've moved beyond this awareness raising work, but there's still a lot that needs to be done to raise awareness of modern slavery, and it can be quite challenging to do so as well. So particularly the work that we've done previously with small businesses, it's trying to explain that modern slavery isn't just about poor working conditions as well. It's much more like severe and extreme forms of exploitation as well. And so when you're trying to communicate or raise an awareness to businesses, it's often I find best to explain the continuum of exploitative practices and actually demonstrate how it sits there as well. So, tackling modern slavery doesn't, when you have, for instance, decent working practices in place, decent working practices are really important for tackling poor labor exploitation, poor forms of labor abuse, but also extreme forms of exploitation mounted as modern slavery as well. So it's just trying to explain how modern slavery sits in this continuum of experiences as well. I find that really effective in terms of engaging businesses in this issue.
Thanks. And just quickly, the 26,000, I mean, between yourselves, 26,000, this is from Andrea. It was about, I've already taken it off actually, it was about 26,000 has a clause on modern slavery.
Yes, I believe it's 26,000 on social responsibility. And yes, it does. So the standard actually references numerous other standards as well. So as I mentioned, modern slavery, it's a very complex issue, and it crosses or overlaps with other existing issues such as social responsibility and health and safety, for instance, and risk management, so it does cover quite or reference quite other standards that are really relevant to tackling this issue.
Mhm. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, Andrea and Anita, for those questions as well. So I have now a next presentation, and thank you. Now, just introduce Dr. Alexander Trottrums. He's Associate Director for the Business and Economies Program at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab. Now, this is actually where we kind of kicked off the whole modern slavery standard initiative. I know, frankly, there was other discussions about it with people before, but this is the time it really took off. They're gathering together the relevant stakeholders. So very grateful to the Rights Lab and Nottingham University for hosting us and getting that initiative. Alex's research is impact focused and solution oriented, and focuses on developing knowledge that supports the eradication of modern slavery from supply chains. He's working closely with policymakers, NGOs, and business practitioners, and he's helped produce and implement guidance against modern slavery for procurement practitioners for organizations in the private and the public sector. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you everyone for coming along to this session. So I'm just going to connect to the previous points that this is a topic that is increasingly on the top attention of businesses, and we started from the basis of the UK Modern Slavery Act being UK based, but there's a lot more international legislation coming up that is stricter and has stronger enforcement mechanisms than the UK Modern Slavery Act. So in one way or another, this is a topic that organizations are already working on, or that is going to come to them very soon. And when modern slavery usually comes to organizations, and they initially really struggle how to deal with that, because in a business mindset, you're not necessarily quite prepared for how you deal with a very, very serious human rights violation, and how do you deal with that in your organization, particularly as modern slavery very often doesn't necessarily occur in your own organization, but in the wider supply chain, in other companies, other organizations that you do business with, either directly or indirectly through a number of tiers in the supply chain. So in that sense, it can be very difficult for companies to really understand how they can deal with modern slavery, and how they can effectively challenge it in their supply chains. And it's also different to other risks. So I think companies, they usually have some mechanisms how they deal with risks. And modern slavery is I believe quite different, because it is much harder to measure. It is very often more of an issue that companies are engaging in behavior that increases the risk of modern slavery in their supply chain. They're not causing it directly. They're not necessarily directly enslaving people, but they're, for example, putting unnecessary price pressure on their suppliers at very short notice, changing order cycles, putting supplier under pressure to deliver. And a lot of these behaviors, for example, can create environments where modern slavery is more likely to occur, although the company did not necessarily directly want to cause modern slavery. So it's this indirectness that makes it quite difficult. It's also, of course, a risk that is much harder to repair when it happens. And so there's a lot of the normal risk mechanisms in companies that are not necessarily that appropriate for dealing with modern slavery. And the key point for us really is educating businesses on this topic, because it is very often that companies unintentionally increase the risk of modern slavery in their organization or in their supply chains. And really important is to understand the vulnerability of people. And so we've really taken an approach in this standard where we're taking a people focus, where organizations need to start looking for where in their supply chains, where in the organizations are people particularly vulnerable, but also where as a company are they particularly vulnerable. So where are they, for example, engaging with suppliers who are using employment models that may be increasing vulnerability, right? Where are they engaging with suppliers where you can obviously notice that they would use more labor from populations that are more vulnerable. But then also in their supply chain. So where in their supply chains are companies, for example, not really sure what's going on in there, where they don't really know a lot about the people that they do business with, and so on. So it's really about companies learning about this people focus, learning about where in their business activities, not just in their own business, but more widely, do vulnerabilities exist? Where do they encourage or increase these vulnerabilities? And very often, where are these power imbalances that Akila already referred to? So power imbalances with any form of checks and balances always, have kind of this risk of leading to a power abuse. And companies often can find themselves in actually supporting some of these power imbalances through structural inequities in their supply chain. The other thing that really is important for companies, I think, to understand is that they cannot scrutinize 100% of their supply chain in detail. So it is really understanding where and how to prioritize. So where in their supply chain are the biggest exposures to modern slavery? And where in your supply chain do you actually have any leverage to do something about it? And that can be very different between different businesses. So for example, if you're a facilities management company, a lot of this risk may actually be in your own workforce, the labor that you hire either directly or through recruitment agents and labor agencies. Whereas, for example, if you're a car manufacturer, your own workforce will be quite well paid, but you'll have actually a lot of modern slavery risk probably in your wider supply chain when you look at the raw materials, when you look at minerals, and when you look at for example leather seeds, where's the leather coming from? So different companies really find that they are exposed to modern slavery in very different ways, and it's very important for companies to understand that. And again, it is this understanding vulnerabilities and structural power imbalances in their supply chain and power imbalances between employers and employees, that's really the knowledge that they need to think about where they are the most exposed to modern slavery risk. And very often that knowledge that they need comes from outside the business management community. And I think we're really grateful for all the committee members that have volunteered, and it's a great composition, I believe, of people who work for anti-slavery NGOs, who have others who have been for some time working with companies or in companies against modern slavery. It was very important for us to have a survivor of modern slavery as a member on the committee to get that really important input and sense check onto the committee. And of course, we have also people who are more experienced in standards making and coming more from a risk management community and really help us to convert this anti-slavery knowledge into business processes. And so I think it's a really great committee, and it's sometimes a challenge, but also I think it's very enriching to bring these different perspectives into a single standard. And so the motivation for us really to write this standard was to raise the bar. So I think at the moment, and I think it probably links back a little bit to Anita's question, is you have some companies who are already doing really great stuff against modern slavery in their supply chains, and they are getting better and better. But there's also plenty of companies that don't really do much. They do the bare minimum or even less than that. And the weakness of the Modern Slavery Act in the UK kind of lets them get away with that. So I think where we really see the standard to sit is to raise the bar, where we can communicate with saying, well, this is what experts from across the field believe is good practice. And this is for you to learn about that best practice, to think about, can you implement that in your own organization? And some of that, again, is more applicable than others, depending on what kind of organization you are and where your risk is. So it's this raising the bar and educating companies to be able to raise that bar. And so so really bringing together these best practices in a more general standards that then individual sectors, for example, can tailor to their specific sectors. So we already know, for example, the utilities sector has set up in a little group where they are planning to kind of connect to our standards and kind of translate it into the particular risk profile of their sector, the particular products that they source, the particular employment models that they would find in their supply chains. Because industry communities very often find that actually they got a lot in common with their peers. So a lot of these companies will experience similar problems, and they can, I think, use this standard to learn together and together improve the standards or the practices that are happening within their industry. And so for us, really, I think this is a really important step to contribute to this anti-slavery effort in businesses and to support this momentum that is happening at the moment in industry and in policymaking across the world. And I just leave it at that. And I don't know, Dave, if I hand back to you for the Q&As.
Okay, so on the issue of this interaction with others, you say within industry, and also some of the things that have come up during the discussions would be other sectors that may have a keen interest in modern slavery. You mentioned obviously procurement and the supply chain. That's got to be the key area, right? But what you mentioned risk management, it's interesting to see that risk management seems to be the way that we're tackling it, or laying out the standard in order to assess the risks. And that's one way of doing it, and it's probably a good way of doing it. But some of the other things that have been mentioned have been corruption and anti-bribery and actually occupational health and safety. So those later three ones, what's the relationship with the corruption, fraud,
it's really so we know that modern slavery is more likely to occur in countries that also do poorly on bribery and corruption. So I think we increasingly recognize that a lot of the SDGs are interconnected, and so is modern slavery is interconnected. We also know, for example, modern slavery is connected, for example, to pollution and environmentally unsustainable behavior too. So this is also, I think, in the standard, we really made it a topic focus and engaged across the field. So we have a section on bribery. We're not replicating an anti-bribery standard, but there is an anti-bribery component in our standard, and that is important. There's also, for example, the whistleblowing component that's been featured in there. So in that sense, we are connecting to a lot of other standards, and I think also to some extent bringing them together in this modern slavery focus, because it needs, it is a very specialist area, modern slavery, but it touches on a lot of other practices and industry mechanisms that are there. And I think there was a question on, for example, Middle East, and I think that picks on a really.
Can you read that question, please? Just because everybody else.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you can't see it. It's from Andrea, and it's on, for example, recruitment of construction labor in, I assume, Gulf countries, and that is indeed quite a challenge. So modern slavery comes through different forms, and it can, you know, the response to it will look different if you're running a construction site in a Gulf state than if it happens in the UK. And again, it goes, for example, from this position of understanding worker vulnerability. So if I engage in construction activities in the Gulf, then I need to understand the framework that I'm operating in and how it creates vulnerabilities. And I think particularly that area of the world has been recognized in having a migrant employment framework that really increases the vulnerability of workers hugely. And that, of course, then also needs to feed into how I manage that as a business in that area of the world. So we, alongside much of the anti-slavery community, we would not say, you know, just pull out of this territory and don't do business there anymore. But you still need to, you know, make sure that you protect workers. And so, for example, we have a huge section on understanding vulnerabilities. We have a big section on recruitment. And so, for example, that's where, for example, fair recruitment comes into this. It's of course not a construction standard. So we keep it a bit more general. But yeah, components of recruitment, understanding the vulnerability of migrant workers are absolute, you know, very important features in that standard.
Okay. Now, Akila, do you see the question from Liz Walmsley? If not, can I read it out for you? You mentioned,
Yes, I can see.
but it's about education and awareness. What about consumer awareness and consumer power as an instrument for change? Is the advertising community engaged?
I think it's really important to raise awareness among consumers, but I think we have to acknowledge the limitation with this as well, and the limitations of consumer power, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of consumers as well to exert pressure on organizations to tackle modern slavery. Now, the reason why I've said that as well, so I mentioned earlier about Section 54 of the anti-slavery legislation that focuses on transparent supply chains. And one of the criticisms of the legislation is that there's a lack of teeth in enforcement, but also drive to encourage businesses to act. And if you look at the government guidance, it relies on consumers and investors to actually be the ones to determine whether a business is compliant with legislation as well, and monitor their statements. Now, consumers don't have the capacity to read every single modern slavery statement and determine whether, you know, the information that is being provided is what is appropriate and is of good quality as well, and to be able to kind of compare statements as well. And so, I think we have to acknowledge that yes, it's important to increase consumer awareness, and yes, you know, consumers can contribute potentially to you know, reputational damage, for instance, but that isn't the end all to ensuring organizational response at all. In fact, some studies actually show that consumer awareness of exploitative practices in a company's supply chains has no effect whatsoever on them. So I wouldn't say it's the end all really. And what we really need is robust legislation and but also guidance such as the standards that actually aim to actually educate businesses on the risk of people within their supply chains. So I think really it's a smart mix of regulation, guidance, education that's needed to kind of drive change.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So Alex, you got a thumbs up from Richard Jones, who was a valuable committee member. He says, great presentation. Now, Akila, don't be jealous because you had the same from a number of other people, Suze. I think you're about even now. Would you agree that more brands should be encouraged to sign up to initiatives such as the new international accord? So this is Alex. and that the international accord that's followed the previous Bangladesh Accord?
So I think the Bangladesh Accord, that's generally been seen as a very good thing particularly in bringing together not brands with governments and labor unions. So that's something I think people have seen or see is seen as having generated progress. The question, of course, often with these initiatives is we can't necessarily judge the motivation why brands sign up for them, right? So I think if companies only treat this as like a marketing exercise that they have signed up to an initiative, that's not really what we are after, right? So it is really about they're changing their behavior and how they do things. However, I think what the Bangladesh Accord really set a really great example is that in many areas also as a company, there's a limit to what you can do, and you really need the state to also be involved. And I think a lot of companies see that at the moment with sourcing from some areas of China, for example. The moment the state is not supporting labor compliance, then you have limitations. And I think that's also in the standard is you can still do things, and you should do. But you also, again, need to be very aware of, what is the support framework that the state offers. And also, when you, for example, think about the moment you identify victims in your supply chain, not in every country in the world, it might be the best idea to work with the authorities, right? In some areas that may put the victim at a higher risk. And so I think having these more general principles in an organization about how you, for example, deal with victim identification is really what we are quite keen on. I think there was a question in the chat around tendering, and I just wanted to pick that question as well, because that ethical responsible procurement is also a very big feature in 25700. And I think it's exactly where we want to be. I think we want companies to understand which of their procurement areas are at particularly high risk. And yes, very often it's the price focused ones, right? The commodities that you're buying. And actually, incorporate that in their tender criteria. Incorporate questions about modern slavery prevention, modern slavery action that companies are undertaking. And I think that also nicely closes the circle to what Akila mentioned. A lot of the modern slavery topic will come to smaller companies through these processes. So you have bigger companies, for example, sending out tender requirements. And so there are questions that also small and medium-sized enterprises will be requested to answer. And they really need to equip themselves to be able to answer these tender questions in a meaningful way.
Okay, Alex, thank you so much for that. We want to have a right hard stop. We've been told, and there's some other chats. There might be one or two other questions that we'll miss, but thank you for submitting those. And there's opportunity to address those later. Akila, 30 seconds. Any final word from you? Put you on the spot there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave. No, I think the final. Sorry, my throat's a bit hoarse. But I think the final thing for me, again, I've said before, is I really think this standard is key to kind of going above and beyond compliance. It's not aiming to replace legislative frameworks at all, but it's aiming to educate businesses and how they can go above and beyond to actually affect change in tackling modern slavery in the supply chains. Again, it also demonstrates that it's not solely a risk to the organization. It's a risk to people, vulnerable people, and I think that's really important in actually making waves and tackling this issue.
Okay, well, listen, my final word is to thank you both co-chairing this very important committee, doing very, very important work. So a heartfelt thank you to you both for co-chairing it. And I see the committee members, obviously the committee members as well. Thank you very much for your valuable volunteer work in making this happen. Look for the DPC, it should be out soon. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the BSI sessions today. Thank you. Bye-bye.